everybody. Once again, if you missed it at the beginning, we're in a series called The Way, and we're talking about just this important reality that we believe so deeply here at Pathfinder, that Jesus came not only to show us the way to the Father, the way to eternal life. We believe that's true. But he also came to show us the way to living a whole life now. And we even say here at Pathfinder that we're bringing together imperfect people in pursuit of that whole life. And it's not gonna be a perfect life here and now. God's gonna take care of that in the end. But along the way, Jesus is our guide into all aspects of living. And so week by week, we're looking at these different ways: our spirituality, our finances, our mental health, our physical health. We're gonna look at our relationships. And today we're gonna talk about the vocational way. And I think of all the things we're gonna talk about, vocational is probably the word that is maybe the least known or the least used in our regular vocabulary. I remember the first time that I kind of became acquainted with this word, vocation or vocational. I was a freshman in high school, brand new to high school, just kind of getting the lay of the land. And I noticed something early on, first couple of weeks, I noticed that a bunch of the juniors and seniors, and at my high school, for some reason, these were a lot of the most popular kids in school. I noticed that about halfway through the day, they would leave school. And I thought, man, how do you get on this thing to go hang out with all the popular kids? And here's what I discovered, that a lot of those kids were going to a place called Votech. Now, I don't know if you all had Votech or if you've heard of, maybe some of you at home. Votech, I came to understand, first it sounded like a hairdryer or a jet engine. I didn't know what it was. But I came to understand that Votech meant vocational and technical training, or vocational and technical education. And in our community, there was this whole center. It served multiple school districts. And you would go, and what I came to kind of understand is that those students were students who were likely not going on to college. Instead, they were training for a future in being a mechanic or being an electrician or being in the hospitality industry or something like that. And so for me, I got this impression early on because I was a college-bound kid, and so I had this impression that, vocational means you're not going to college. And the reason I was going to college is because my dad was a guy who, throughout his entire life, worked with his hands. And he worked really hard. He wore his body out working as a carpenter. And I got to see that firsthand. I've shared this before, but my dad used to have me work with him on weekends or over the summer. And I made it clear the whole time that I was working with my dad, even though he paid me pretty well, I made it clear that I hated it. You know how that is. You don't even need to use words, right? It's just the whole time I'm just mad about being there. And my dad every once in a while would just go, "You hate this stuff, don't you?" I'd be like, "Yeah, I hate this kind of work." And he'd say, "Good, it's good. I'm glad you hate it, because that means you're gonna pay attention at school, you're gonna go to college, and you're not gonna have to do all this hard work your whole life." And now, on the flip side, now that I'm a homeowner, I'm really glad I got to learn some of that stuff, because I don't know how you can afford to keep up a house any other way. And I also look at my dad's time spent building with his hands, and I think it was an amazing way to spend a life. And I kind of digress here, but here's my initial impression of what vocation meant. Vocation meant that you weren't going to college, and in my mind there was kind of this fork in the road. You either would have a vocation or you would have a career. But what I've come to understand is that vocation isn't just for some kids. It's not just for some of us, but vocation is something that is so important for all of us. It's one of the most important parts of our life. That's why we're talking about it here in the series. But what does it actually mean? What it actually means is simply this: vocation means calling. Now, about 20 years ago, Pastor Rick Warren, he wrote a book, and the book was focused around a singular question. The question was, what on earth am I here for? Anyone remember the name of the book? Anybody? At home, you can shout it out. At home, here in the room, here in Ellisville, anyone? Purpose-Driven Life, that's right. Here at this church, I know we had lots of groups study it. That book, over 20 years, has sold over 50 million copies. It's been translated into 85 languages, which means that question, what on earth am I here for, is a question that hits, it resonates with all of us. And it gets to this idea of calling. Rick Warren called it purpose. Today we're talking about vocation or calling. I want to be crystal clear about something in case you are confused about this like I was for a lot of my life. Vocation means calling. Vocation does not mean job. A job may be a part of your vocation, but that's not what it means on its own. And I want to be even clearer if we employ the substitutionary principle of mathematics here. For clarity's sake, vocation equals calling, vocation does not equal job. That means calling, your calling, is not equal to your job. And yet here's what happens when we feel dissatisfied or we feel unfulfilled with our sense of calling, or we're asking this question that Rick Warren asked, what on earth am I here for? We almost always start here, don't we? We start with our job. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics says that the average baby boomer over the course of their career, studied this because most baby boomers are getting near the end of their career, have worked an average of 12 different jobs. The average tenure is 5 years at a job. Studying all generations in the workforce right now, that same bureau said that about 55% of us feel satisfied with our jobs, which sounds good until you realize that 45% of us are dissatisfied with our jobs. And there may be good reasons for that. You know, if you're in a toxic work environment or it's not aligned with your gifts. But we all know that when you're working a job that you don't love, that life becomes drudgery. It's not just your job life that is affected, your whole life is affected. And when you're not sure about what you're called to do, so many of us, we go to this place of job and we jump jobs and we try to find the right job that's gonna bring fulfillment to our whole lives. And your work is important. But if we're gonna wrestle with this bigger question of what am I here to do? What's my purpose? What's my calling? You can't start here with job. You've got to start at a higher level. You've got to start with a bigger picture of calling. That's what Jesus does today as we look at his words from the Sermon on the Mount. Again, throughout the series, we're just studying 3 chapters of Matthew 5 through 7, this famous sermon of Jesus, the Sermon on the Mount, where he talks about the kingdom way, his way for all aspects of our life. And this is right at the beginning. He has just given us the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, all of that. And then, as he's speaking generally, he turns to his disciples seated there and he says this, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. And again, he looks at him and he says, you are the light of the world. A town built on a hill, it cannot be hidden. If you want to conceal a town, you build it in a valley, right? Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, and I say these verses every time we baptize someone here at Pathfinder, in the same way, let your light shine before others that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. So again, this is right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, the beginning of this sermon. He's got these disciples there who are brand new to their role, to their job. They're following him around, and Jesus starts their on-the-job training. This is their onboarding process. But I want you to notice before he dives into a list of roles or duties or responsibilities, before he gets into their job description, before he gets into hey, for this job, here's what you do, he starts a level higher, doesn't he? The first words are, you are. You are. You are salt. You are light. And we could make too much about the two things that Jesus has chosen there. You are salt, you are light. But I want you to think about it this way. If you are salt, you don't really have a choice about what you do. If you're salt, you salt things. Salt is salty. Light shines. I think that's kind of the whole point. You know, if salt loses its saltiness, well, how on earth does salt lose its saltiness? If salt isn't salty, it's not salt, right? It's just what it is. It does what it is. Light shines. You can't stop light from shining. Even if you put it under a bowl, as Jesus says, it's still shining. It's just under the bowl. It's concealed, but it's still doing its thing. See, so often when we're wrestling with a sense of calling or vocation or purpose, we want to go immediately to, okay, what am I supposed to do? But Jesus starts a level higher, and that's where we need to start too. Our calling always starts bigger than what we do. It begins with who we are. Look at it this way. When I'm thinking about calling, it first goes to who I am, and then it goes to what I do. And if we start this any other way, it's not going to work out well for us. I'll talk more about that later. Calling first starts with this question of who am I, or a declaration of who I am. Jesus says to his disciples, you are salt, you are light. For us here today, when we're wrestling with calling, here's what you need to know first. That you are called to be a daughter or a son. A daughter or son of the Most High God. That's who you're called to be. And notice, before you're called to do anything, you're called to be something. And you're called to be a daughter or a son. Look at what Paul says in Ephesians 2. He says, consequently, you are no longer, right? This is change in identity. You are no longer foreigners and strangers, but now you are fellow citizens with God's people and also members of his household. You're not just citizens, but you're members of his household. That means you're part of his family. Or Galatians 3 says it even more clearly. So in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who are baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. That's a declaration we need to hear. That's who we are. And here's the great thing about this calling. You don't have to audition for it. You don't have to interview for it. You don't have to create a resume for it. And yet a lot of us think about it this way, that if I want to be called a daughter or son, I got to prove myself. I got to act a certain way. I've got to get my act together. I've got to reflect the Father. No, that's not how it works. Ephesians 2 again says, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith. That means that this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God. This calling is a gift from God. It's not by your works. See, it's a call to be, not a call to do. It's not by works, so that no one can boast. Now, for some of you, maybe this feels obvious, but I don't think it's as obvious as we might think, especially as it relates to calling, because when we go to calling, I see this time and time again in people, in myself, immediately we want to go to do, but God says, don't start with do, start with who you are. I've called you to be my daughters and sons. I've called you to belong to me. That's where calling starts. In being, not doing. And I'll tell you, as I've wrestled with calling, as I continue to wrestle with the sense of calling in my life, this is the thing that I'm most reluctant to do, to understand that first, before I do anything, because I'm a doer. Anyone, any other doers like to do? There's like 3 of you. Y'all just, I know better, right? There are a lot of us who are like, yeah, we're doers, we're gonna do. That's how we find our identity, that's what we, before you're called to do anything, God says, you're called to be. Now, some of you today, maybe in this message, you're like, oh, great, I'm gonna figure out, what job I should have or what I should do about this, this issue in my career or whatever. And we'll get there. But first, I just need you to understand this, that today God is inviting you to belong to his family. He's inviting you to be a son or daughter of his. And it doesn't matter what you've been up to this point. It doesn't matter what you've achieved or how you've fallen short. None of that matters. See, no matter who you are, who you've been, what people have said about you, no matter, God's looking at you right now and he's inviting you to be his son, to be his daughter. Before you talk about doing, he's just inviting you to receive this identity, to receive this calling on your life. And if we're ever gonna get a sense of peace in our spirits about what we're called to do, what on earth we're here to do, we've got to start here first with what God has called us to be. And then after we get this right, then we can go on to the next step, that you are called to do good works. Again, Ephesians, Paul says, we are God's handiwork. So this is also who we are. We're sons and daughters, we're also handiwork. That means we're created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Here's the great thing about this. As we're talking about calling today, you know what this means? These first layers of our calling, it means that about 80% of the work is done for us if we're wrestling with this question of what am I here for? And if you're in Christ, about 80 or 90% of that answer is given right here. You're called to be a daughter or son. You're called to do good works. That means you're called to be salt and light. You're called to bring the goodness of God into the world. You're called to love God. You're called to love your neighbor. That's it. And if we just embrace these 2 parts of our calling right here, we're 80 or 90% of the way there. We will find fulfillment and joy and purpose like never before just by embracing these things. I don't have to know anything about you other than a simple question: are you in Christ? If so, this is what you're called for. This is what you've been called to do. And then, and only then, after we get these two parts, these first two parts, these two layers right, can we go to the layer that I think all of us want to go to, a layer deeper. We say, great, this is what I'm called to do. I'm called to do good works. But what does that mean specifically for me? What does that mean uniquely for me? Now, Paul talks about in another place that there is a different kind of service that we might be called into. That, yeah, we're all called to do good works, but those good works might look different depending on who we are. 1 Corinthians 12, he says, there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service. We're all called to serve, but we're given different kinds of service by virtue of our gifts. But they all come from the same Lord. Don't be confused about that. There are different kinds of working, right? Different kinds of jobs to do, but in all of them and in everyone, it's still the same God at work. Now, to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given, and it's given for the common good. And then he goes on and he lists all these different unique gifts that the Holy Spirit might give to us. And we think, okay, finally, yeah, this is what I've been waiting for. We're like, 10, 20 minutes in or something, and we're finally getting to the part of the message that I came here for. I want to know about how God has uniquely called me, how he's gifted me, so that I can use that in a way that's meaningful for me and a blessing to others. So how do you figure this out? Well, for starters, you can just go and you can Google spiritual gifts inventories or spiritual gifts inventory, and you'll find free inventories that take you through the list that Paul will talk about in 1 Corinthians 12 and Romans 12 and 1 Peter 4 and Ephesians 4, these chapters of spiritual gifts, and you'll be able to assess like, oh, how has God's Spirit uniquely gifted me? And that can be a really helpful thing. Outside of the faith realm, there's a tool called StrengthsFinder. I don't know if you've heard of that. I really like StrengthsFinder. It'll give you a list of your top strengths, and it's just a way to look to say, how has God uniquely gifted me? Or for absolutely free today, I'll give you this list. You can take a picture of it and maybe journal on these things later. This will reveal a lot about how God has specifically called you to serve. You could ask, what am I passionate about? Or a question I like, what annoys me? Sometimes passion's hard to figure out, but what annoys me, that's easy. I'm easily annoyed. And all of those annoyances are clues to what I might actually be gifted for. If you come to church and you notice every time there's a typo and it gets under your skin, it's probably saying something about a gift you have. If you walk into a space and you see the clutter, it probably means that you have a gift for some kind of organization, right? We get a lot of cues or clues about what we're gifted to do based on what annoys us. Or what do I get affirmed for? What do people see in me? It's hard to see it in yourself sometimes. Or what doesn't get done when I'm not around? You go on vacation for a week and you come back to work and you're like, you didn't do why didn't you do this? Or why didn't anyone pick up the slack for this? Or you go home and you see that, well, again, maybe that's a clue to something that you uniquely contribute. Or what do I truly value? Right now I'm kind of working through that Stephen Covey exercise, that exercise where you write your own obituary. It's morbid, but right? I mean, because you're beginning with the end in mind and you start to wrestle with, what do I truly value? When it's all said and done, what do I want said about my life? And once you figure out your values, that probably is a clue to your greater purpose. Or this question, when do I find myself in the zone? Now, a couple of months ago, I saw that new Disney Pixar movie, Soul. Anyone seen that movie, Soul? As I saw that movie, at first I was really annoyed because it was about part of it's about the afterlife, and I'm like, Pixar, I don't need you trying to tell me about the afterlife, right? I was annoyed. That's my job. That's not your job. So I was kind of annoyed with it because it was all weird. But then it got really poignant for me. And I won't spoil the whole movie for you. I think it's worth a watch. Again, there's some crazy stuff in there. I think there's some helpful stuff in there too. But there is a group of people and they're taking a tour of kind of the beyond, the afterlife. And they observe a couple things. One of the things they observe in this realm before people kind of go on to their final destination is they observe people who are still on earth, but their essence is in this in-between place. And they're identified as people who are in the zone. Now, we all know what it means to be in the zone, right? I mean, in the zone means those moments in life when you're so dialed into what you're doing, you're so in the moment that it's like time stands still, you don't know how much time has passed, you are just fully immersed, you don't notice anything, you're not hungry, you're not thirsty, you're so dialed into what you're doing, it's almost a euphoric experience. And in this movie, they kind of depict it that way, of you're kind of scratching into this other zone, this other realm, when you're really aligned with your purpose. And I think, gosh, isn't that what we all want? We want to find that thing where it's just like it's a joy to go to work every day, it's a joy to live life. We're just so dialed in, we hardly notice the time passing by. For so many of us, we think that's ideal. But then came a warning in this movie. Their guide, Moonwind, sees these other people and points them out. There are these ghoulish kind of people called lost souls. And he says, lost souls are not that different from those in the zone. The zone, being in the zone, is enjoyable, but when that joy becomes an obsession, right? When we just want to get there to the zone, one becomes disconnected from life. Lost souls are obsessed by something that disconnects them from life. And I want you to think about that for a second. This could apply to a lot of things in your life, maybe. An obsession with something that is enjoyable, that you think is going to make you feel alive, but it actually disconnects you from living. But this is certainly true of how a lot of us approach our careers, our jobs, right? We're looking for the thing that will make us feel alive. But in so doing, in relentlessly pursuing that job that's going to fulfill us, we miss out on our chance to live. We miss out on our greater sense of calling. If we can go back to this idea that your calling does not equal your job, that's so important for us to understand. That your job, it can fit your calling, but they're not one and the same. And yet we put so much pressure on our jobs to fulfill us. We want to find the perfect job that's going to make us feel fully alive. And I get why. We spend a lot of time there at work. We spend a lot of our waking hours thinking about our work. We spend a lot of our sleeping hours, unfortunately, thinking about our work. Our work's where we give our best energy. It's where we have some of our deepest relationships. It makes sense. But here's the truth. You can live a life of great purpose. You can live life with a strong sense of calling, clear calling, God-focused calling, and work a job that's just a job. In fact, you might actually be happier if you could find a job that was just a job, if you let your job become less dominant in your overall sense of calling. My Papa JT was the perfect example of this. He was a guy who worked his whole life in factories. He worked in tool and die, and eventually worked up to management, but he spent his whole life in factories in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And yet, he was clear on his sense of calling. He loved his family, he loved music, he loved Jesus. He felt called to serve all of those things. So on Sunday mornings, he'd go with his guitar, and he and my granny would go, and they'd go to nursing homes, and they would lead people in worship there. And he grew things in his backyard. He rented space in a bigger garden where he could grow things and just farm the earth. And he was an amazing grandpa, and he brought so much joy into our lives. And he worked in a factory his whole life. But he had this sense of calling that was so much bigger. I was telling this to Chris Toomey this week, who's on our staff, and he's like, that it's the same with my granddad. He said his granddad, his entire life, drove a truck for Mayfield Dairy. Anyone know Mayfield Dairy in Tennessee? A couple of you do, and some of you online definitely do. It's like, his whole entire life, he drove a truck for Mayfield Dairy. And yet that wasn't his calling. He went on and he became a lay minister, and he also led music in his church on the weekends, and loved his family and served his family. I mean, his calling was so much bigger. He had a job that was a job, but his calling was so much bigger. And here's what else I can say about both those men. Here's what I know, that both of those men, even while they were working a job that wasn't exactly aligned with their gifts, I mean, they were good at it. It was a way to make a living. Here's what I know, that they were seeing that job as an opportunity to fulfill their greater calling as sons of God and to be salt and light in the world, to do good works to people around them. Their job did not limit their sense of calling. They didn't wait around for someone to give them a job description that enabled them, that gave them permission to live out their calling. They were gonna live out their calling no matter what. You see, we put so much pressure on our jobs to be the thing that's gonna embody our entire calling that those jobs become a pursuit that often leads us away from wholeness. They become idols in and of themselves. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Some of you are thinking, well, that's easy for you to say. Because here I am, I'm a guy who has a career that's built around my bigger sense of calling. Lucky me, right? Maybe. I'll tell you, there are moments where it's nice when your calling aligns with your work. But increasingly, I also think that it can be dangerous. Here's what's been clear to me for the last 25 years of my life. My deep sense of calling is to be a son of God. I feel called to be a husband. I feel called to be a father. Then my deep sense of calling, the last 25 years, has been so clear to me, is to help people see God as he really is, not as we imagine him to be. And you know how I became aware of that calling to help people see God as he really is, not how we imagine him to be? I became aware of that calling because I got annoyed with how other people talked about God, how other people described God, how other people saw God. It irritated me. It irritates me still to this day when God is described or seen as some sort of cosmic scorekeeper who's like just, making a list and being like, oh, no, okay, plus, minus, oh. Like that's all God is doing is just watching over us and going like, oh, that was good, that was bad, oh, you're gonna pay for that. It irritates me when that's all that God becomes. It also irritates me when God becomes a picture of a kind older relative who's very good and loving, but mostly just sits around and naps all day. Kind of looking at us, they'll figure it out. Uninvolved, disengaged, that irritates me too. See, in my family story, here's what I came to see. I came to see that God is powerful and he's good. God is the passionate pursuer of people. That God is not passive and he's not overly judgmental. Instead, what he does is he pursues people who have lived life their own way and made a mess of things and found themselves in chains, in pain because we've rejected his wisdom. He pursues them, not with judgment, not with, ha, I told you so, but he pursues them and he holds out life to us. Do you know this? Do you know this is who God is? He's a God who comes and he sees us in our worst moments, in our moments of biggest catastrophe, disaster, and pain, self-created prison and shame. And he comes into those moments, and he's like, let me rescue you. Let me help you break these chains. Let me help clean you up. Let me help you find new purpose. Let me love you. Let me set my affection upon you. Let me bring you into something better. I want to show you life. See, God revealed himself that way to me through my family story because that's what God did. We were this family that God just kept pursuing, and we were so just kind of off the grid, I think, as far as I would imagine God to be concerned, and yet he was there all the time pursuing us with love, inviting us into life, and eventually he won us all over. And so for me, for the last 25 years, just being like, oh my gosh, people need to know about this God, that he's like this. He's not like all the other things that we've made him to be. That has been my deep sense of calling. And I'll tell you still to this day, there is nothing that makes my heart beat faster than that calling. And yet, here's what I'll tell you too. Sometimes I wonder if it was a good idea to take this calling that I'm pretty clear on and to make that my job. Because here's what happens for me in life, and I'm just gonna be really honest here. I get so caught up in doing my job well. And that includes running a big organization and keeping our mission on track and keeping us funded and keeping our staff energized and motivated, which, by the way, is all stuff I love. I love to do that stuff. It's not a burden for me, but I love to do it, but it can get heavy sometimes. But here's what happens is my focus then starts to shift, and here's what happens. I go home at the end of the day and I pull into my neighborhood, this neighborhood that I love, with these neighbors all around me, and so many of these neighbors are not in a relationship with God because they don't see God as he really is. They don't know him as he really is. And I show up in my neighborhood to these neighbors all around me, and the last thing on earth I want to do is to help them see God as he really is. Because I've done that all day. I'm like, you wanna know about God? PathfinderSTL.org, tune into our live stream, right? Or I think at the end of the day, I'm tired of dealing with people. I don't have anything less. See, sometimes, and it's kind of it's a convoluted issue, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but sometimes it almost seems to me that my job actually sometimes works against my ability to fulfill my calling. When I see my job performance or organizational success as what my calling is all about, I can't always see my neighbors before me. In professionalizing my sense of calling, I've allowed it to be downgraded to things like job performance and organizational success. Just Friday afternoon, I sat with my two bosses, the president of our congregation and the chairman of our board of elders. I'm accountable to them, and I did an annual review. These are amazing men. I'm grateful for their leadership and their investment in me, and they hold me accountable and they encourage me, and it's awesome. But I'll tell you, sometimes it's weird to have your deepest, most personal sense of calling, the thing that you just feel is so sacred to you. Sometimes it feels weird to have that evaluated by your bosses. And let's be honest, not just evaluated by your bosses, but evaluated by thousands of people every weekend. Being like, oh yeah, Dion was on it today. He's fulfilling his calling, check marker. I'm not so sure, right? It's weird when those things become all enmeshed together. And not only that, it drives this other question of okay, if my calling is one and the same with my job, then what happens when I go through the thing that most people will go through at some point in their career? What happens when I lose my job? Do I lose my purpose? When I lose my job, is that a sign to me that God has revoked my calling? And I'll just tell you, I'm talking about this because I think I am a cautionary tale that the closer your sense of calling and your job align, the easier it is to fall into the trap that your job is your calling. And for me, I don't think that means that I need to go find a different job or work somewhere else, but what it does mean is I need to untangle my sense of calling from my work. Is there flow? Is there alignment? Sure, but I can't let them become one and the same, because the truth is, I can do the thing that I feel God has called me to do, to make him known as he really is, not as people imagine him to be. I can do that in any job, right? Just in the same way that my papa, JT, fulfilled his calling while working in a factory, I can do that in any job. But when I let my job become co-equal with my calling, when I think my job is my calling, when I'm obsessing about my job and getting the job right and getting my career right, and that's gonna fulfill me, I become one of those lost souls who in searching for life actually misses out on life. In searching for my calling, I actually miss out on all the opportunities around me every day, in my neighborhood, every day with people around me, to live out the thing that God has called me to do. And oh, by the way, I can also forget all the rest of my calling, to be a great husband and a father, and to simply to be a son of the Most High God. See, I want you to remember this, that when we talk about calling, we've got to get the order, we've got to get the flow, the direction of this right, that calling starts first with who I am. That God says, you are daughters, you are sons, you are salt, you are light. It's just who you are. It's who I've called you to be by grace. And then it goes to what I do, and even most of that is the same for all of us. I'm called to love God and love people. I'm called to do good works. I'm called to bring God's goodness into the world. And only after I get those things right can I start to wrestle with the specifics of, okay, but how am I uniquely gifted, and how can I bring that into the world? And maybe my job plays into that, and maybe it doesn't, because my calling works in this direction. And you know what happens when we get this reverse, like we often do? It's a crass metaphor, but man, I'll tell you, this is spot on. When we start to get this reverse, you know what that's like? It's like when you go into the bathroom and you do your business there, and then you flush the toilet, and instead of the things going down, things start to come up. You know that moment, don't you? It's a terrifying moment, especially when you're at someone else's house. Come on, you've been there. You're like, I'm just getting sweaty thinking about it. That's not how it's supposed to work, right? And this is exactly what happens. I told you it's crass, but that's exactly what happens. When my job, my title, becomes the totality of what I do. So if I'm doing good at work, I'm doing good in life. If that becomes the totality of what I do, I see myself, my doing, my actions all through my job, and then my job becomes who I am, and that's how I claim my identity, and that becomes my sense of calling. It is just like that moment. That's not how it's supposed to go. But when you get the order right, here's what's gonna happen. It's gonna take a lot of the pressure off. It's gonna take away a lot of the mystery and the frustration that you might be feeling right now of what on earth should I do to make a living? What should my career be? It'll enable you to work a job and to find purpose, to bring your calling to that job instead of asking that job to be your calling. See, when you start at the top and you go, you know what, no matter what, I'm first called to be. And I'm called to be a child of God, and that's amazing. That's by grace. And then I'm called to do good works, and I can do that no matter what. No matter what, I can do good works. See, when you get the order right, it takes away the pressure, it takes away the confusion and the mystery, and it begins to clarify your life calling. And when you get this order right, here's what you'll find. Immediately, peace will start to come to your spirit. And joy will come into your life, and your life will take on increased meaning and significance. And you will begin to find true life. Not just over the course of your career, but forever, when you get this right. Amen.
Thank you so much for joining us. If you haven't done so already, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you don't miss any of the amazing original content that we're pushing out all the time. Help us grow our community by liking this video and sharing it on your social media. You can also tell us where you're joining from or ask us any questions, and we'd love to hear from you in that way by commenting in the section below. May God bless you on your week.